Today we were going to talk about layers, about specific layers, and about, just to set the groundwork, we have talked about scientific theory versus design theory. Talked about two kinds of design theory, design-related theory. One being design theory, how things are designed. One being domain theories, which are about the content that's put into designs. Is everybody straight on those?
Yes.
And we are talking within which of those boxes now? Our concerns are within
Design theory.
design theory. Okay, we're not going to talk about domain theories, and basically domain theories live within, the kinds of theories that live within domain theories are instructional theories. How do you instruct? Do you use cognitive principles? Do you use constructivist principles? Do you, is your pen going, John? No, okay, good. So we got a backup in case anything should happen. Do you use behaviorist principles? Do you use a discovery approach, a problem-based learning approach, cognitive apprenticeship? Those are all domain theories. Yes, they are. I just had to check and make sure that I had not misspoken. Okay, now, so design theory. Hi, Sue.
I'm so sorry.
We're just here. Make sure you get some jelly bellies. That's today's food value. All sugar.
I feel like I didn't need it because it's not dinner time.
How many calories per jelly belly, by the way?
Not too bad.
Between
5?
4 and 5.
Well,
Now that you can't stop is the problem.
Well, that's true. And you eat them in twos.
Yes.
Get the flavors to blend. The biggest, I've been, I'm rewriting this introductory chapter to this book that I've written, trying to explain why the topic of layers is an important topic. And one of the things I've discovered is there are so many different ways that you can argue for this idea of layers that it's hard to make a single argument that is like compelling. I've been making a list of things and a list of examples where layers exist. Probably a good place for us to start would be to talk about a specific example that could serve as kind of a paradigmatic example. You guys are familiar with Coventry Cathedral, is that right? Where's Coventry Cathedral? Humanities.
It's in England.
It's in England.
It was bombed in the Second World War and they have rebuilt it.
Yes, and it's the rebuilding that is interesting, how they did it. Do you remember?
It's kind of modern and they've got a memorial in it.
Very modern. It's got a memorial, you're right. But there are some parts of the old cathedral that they preserved. I mean, the cathedral was a bombed out hulk with only some walls standing. Part of the main cathedral. And the nave, isn't that where the altar stands? And the altar was still there. Yeah, it's nave and transept. The altar was still standing. And some of the walls. When they redesigned, the motif of the redesign was centered on the altar. And they added to it one additional theme. Phoenix rising from the flames. You guys are familiar with the Phoenix Firebird, okay. I grew up in Phoenix, so I'm well acquainted with that mythical creature. The idea of the altar and the phoenix rising from the flames, that combines to make kind of a motif for the building, doesn't it? Everything else is designed around that motif. There's a picture here of the cathedral interior. This is the bombed out shell. This is before they rebuilt it. There's the remaining altar. as they rebuilt it, it looks, let's go back, I had it just here, right here. There's the new version of it, and you can see that they have retained the old part, and without excuse, they have added this modernistic looking thing. There's the wings coming up out of the flames. Okay, so why is this of interest to us right now? Why is that example of a redesign of a building interesting? And why does it relate to layers, the idea of layers?
Because you can redesign kind of program or instructional event. Maybe because of it has different layers. You can take, I'm just thinking about like Montevideo School, for instance.
Are there layers in a building's design?
Yes.
Okay. We have a little thing on that right here. Where did my tabs go? How do I keep going back and back and back? Give me the other tab, but another tab went away. Oh, there it is, right there. Okay, good. Okay. This is a diagram from, oh, well. So copy it down. Copy it down right now, quick. Okay, this is a diagram. We're going to come back to it in just a second. I want you to see the front piece for it and see what subject matter this idea of layers is being talked about in here. Evidence-centered assessment design, they're talking about learning assessments, layers, structures, and terminology. The theorist on this is Bob Mislevy, or Miss Levy, however you want to say it. Okay? He has developed a theory of evidence-centered assessment design. That is, what he's saying is that a learning assessment is a design thing, and it possesses layers. Okay? Now you can find this on, this is padi.sri.com/downloads/tr9_ECD. It's a PDF. So he comes back to, why is this relevant? You're familiar with a different version of this, but you're familiar with this kind of a diagram, aren't you? This is, what's it talking about here, Sue?
I think it's talking about the same thing that happened when I put that poem up a few weeks ago. Now, there's a whole bunch of layers to that poem, and you sort of have to be blind to one layer to understand another. That is, to understand that structure, you need to sort of not think about the other stuff and just think about the structure. The other stuff is all important. And the poem functions as a whole.
Yeah.
But when you're constructing or deconstructing, analyzing, trying to understand, it's very powerful to be able to take one of those layers and say, wow, look at how brilliant this poem works on one layer. And I think that's what your layers are building there.
I think you're right. For instance, and this is after Stuart Brand. You guys remember, you're all tired of Stuart Brand by now. The structure layer of a design. You can appreciate the structure of a building, a built edifice of some kind.
It's, by the way, a wonderful book.
Oh, you enjoying that?
Stephanie got it, and so I went through it at her house when I was there, and she's loving it, and
Good.
she's sick, by the way. But
And we're recording, so she won't miss a golden drop. Okay, you can appreciate the structure element of a design, the structural element of a design, the structural layer of a design, without worrying about the decorations on the outside of the house. Now, there's an interesting thing about, has our concept of the structuring of that particular layer of building designs evolved over time?
Yes.
From,
A-frames, straw huts, mud adobe shacks, igloos,
yep,
caves.
okay,
So each new, are you trying to say, or is it fair to say that each new technology that's applied to building creates another layer of design that
Yes.
actually wasn't even there before?
another layer, or at least an improvement in the technology of a layer. Good example. There was a time in the history of skyscrapers where they couldn't build above a certain level, a certain number of stories. Why would that be?
This is a structural weight.
Yeah,
You get to a certain height and there's just too much weight.
it would collapse the building if you went above a certain weight. It would start crushing the bricks. Now, is there another historical example where they encountered exactly the same problem? We're thinking 1100, 900 time frame AD, where they discovered that the walls would not stand up anymore. What was it, John?
Oh, I can't remember
Oh.
the thing, but it's the,
That's what
when
I'm
they
about.
strengthened the buttresses
The
on
cathedrals of Europe,
double walled them.
and the invention that they had to, the walls would buckle out. Once they went up to a certain height, the walls started buckling out. And the cathedrals, many cathedrals came crashing down because architects got too ambitious. What was the invention that allowed them? It was those buttresses. And so you look at cathedrals after a certain period of time, and they have buttresses to hold the walls together because they all want to come bulging out. Okay, so in modern American architecture, there was a period of time in Chicago and New York where skyscrapers were becoming the thing, where they couldn't build above a certain level. What was missing? Iron. And so they started making iron frames to buildings. And that allowed them to go up a little bit further. And then what happened? What happens with iron when it's placed under heavy pressure? It becomes brittle and it breaks. So what was the next technological solution? Steel. And it was particular kinds of steel, particular mixtures, alloys of steel, that allowed them to build the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building. By the way, you want to see something interesting about siting, the principle of siting. We sometimes, it's over here and we say, oh, it's the location of the building on the site. It also pertains to the composition of the site. Have you ever looked at a sideways diagram of New York City, Manhattan Island? Where are the structures, the high structures located, the high skyscrapers located on Manhattan? Why did they put a park in the center part? And why are all the skyscrapers located on the two ends of the island? The tall skyscrapers, they're skyscrapers, they're tall buildings, but they're not as tall as these. Why?
Is that where the bedrock is?
The firmest rock is out here, and this ground cannot support as much weight. Okay, so that explains the value of the site consideration. Okay, these are non-trivial kinds of issues for an architect.
That is, if you're blind to a layer, you could make big mistakes.
Oh yeah, yeah. If your skyscraper starts tilting over and leaning on the other, you have the Leaning Tower of Pisa, don't you? there's an architect who didn't understand the value of sight. Okay? So all these layers, Miss Levy is saying, here's what Brand says. He uses another example that you guys are familiar with by now. This is the 7-layer model of the internet, the OSI model, right? Promoted by Cisco Corporation. There's another model of the internet that has how many layers? 4.
4?
Oh, 4 layers.
That was 9.
There are some layers which correspond in the other model. You can look this up. Just type in 4-layer model of the internet and you'll find it. There are some that are the same, some that are left out of the other model, some that are combined. What's inside of these boxes? What's inside of the presentation layer and the application layer? What's inside of any of these boxes?
Domain.
Protocols, languages,
Protocols.
syntax.
That's right. There's a language, there's a set of protocols. What's a protocol?
It's a language.
It's
Set of standards. way
It's
of
a
doing things.
language and a set of programs. It's actually a set of programs that performs a certain set of functions. So when you're over here and you enter something into an email, you're entering it into a set of programs, application programs in this case, your email program. And it has ways of translating something to let you see it on the screen, but also it allows you to send something and have it transported across a network, across data links, through a physical layer, which may consist of
Big
Wireless.
transatlantic cables.
wireless satellite signal, to something on the other end which is able to decode, and present it to you, to the person that you sent with, to the person you sent it to. Does that make sense, John?
You see that as well in security, right? When you log onto a BYU computer, you have your BYU Net ID. And then you have to log in again when you do your wireless. Your wireless is another
That's right.
security layer they have.
That's right.
Sometimes documents have passwords on them, so there's all
Applications
kinds
have
of
passwords, that's
applications.
right.
They have security layers embedded.
Okay, and so you're crossing an invisible boundary when you have to enter your new password. And when a computer programmer wants to add something to the program, maybe to the internet, maybe there's a function here that doesn't accommodate the types of data that their application program produces. Oh my gosh, we've got to have a new protocol here, a new computer program to handle just our kind of data. And if you'll look, I can find it real quick here. Let's find the 7-layer, no, that's 7 layers, a dip that you choose.
7-layer dip, that's good stuff.
Actually, that was the 7-layer. Let's go with the 4-layer internet model,
TCP/IP.
TCP/IP. Now, here's what you'll see. These over here in the green, the application layer, the transport layer, the internet layer, and the link layer. Does some of those seem familiar compared to what was just up on the screen? Okay. But what are all these little things down here separated by the dots? What is that?
Different protocols, right?
They are different protocols,
Created
different
over time.
programs that have been written that deal just with the interests of this layer. Have you ever heard of FTP? You've had to deal with FTP sometimes. It's a file transfer protocol, right? STMP,
Send mail, simple mail.
Simple
Simple
transfer.
mail. transfer protocol. The POP protocol. Sometimes when you're trying to set up an email account with an organization, it'll say, do you want POP or STMP? You know, and you'll say, I don't care. I don't know anything about those things. There's an IMAP protocol. There's a DNS protocol. There's a Telnet protocol. Historically, all of these have been used for a particular purpose. and different users use them for different purposes. They handle a certain set of functions that are dealt with by the application layer. They perform certain functions for you. And that idea of function is very important. A layer is defined in terms of the functions that are performed within it. The transport layer has different things. Well, TCP is down here. And then a whole bunch of other things that you haven't heard too much about. The RSVP, the RIP, the BGP, the Boogaloo, the ECN. I have no idea what those protocols are about or who invented them. But somebody knows, somebody lives and dies by the existence of SCTP, which is the Stream Control Transmission Protocol. Okay? It serves in similar to popular protocols. TCP and UDP provide some of the same service features of both. Okay, yada, 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 and it's so detailed and so uninteresting. And I have no idea what it's all about, but if it wasn't there, then somebody wouldn't be able to use the internet and wouldn't be able to perform the transport layer functions on the internet. Somebody wouldn't be able to. Now most of us use TCP IP. Oh, here's IP down here, excuse me. Here's the IP. So TCP IP actually is a set of protocols that handles these functions under these layers. Now, if we were to go back to the other model, let's go to the 7-layer model, or the OSI model. Here's the OSI model. And you'll notice they've done the same thing. They have things separated out by the layers in the design. Application layer, presentation, session, transport. Now there's FTP up there in the application layer. There's Gopher, which wasn't even mentioned in the other set of protocols. There's HTTP. HTTP ought to be familiar because we have to type that in our web addresses, STMP protocol. Where is TCP? Right down here. It's several layers down in this model, and there's IP. So these two, the presentation layer and the session layer, are somehow bundled in the other model. Now, why am I talking about this?
I have a question about it.
Yes.
The last time we talked about this, you said that the layers are in the eye of the beholder. So
That's right.
is one person collapsing several functions into one layer as they identify it?
Yes.
And why can they do that? I mean, what are the costs and losses of collapsing them or spreading them out?
That's a great question. Okay. First of all, why can they do that? Well, because technology isn't about somebody else's rules and regulations. Technology is like the Wild West, and you can invent anything that you can make stick. Okay? As a matter of fact, technology invites you to invent. John?
I saw on the SM, the one that we looked at closely, it said congestion control. So I suspect that protocol was developed to improve the amount of congestion or to decrease congestion for whatever the previous layer was, right? So there was this evolution of a protocol into a new one, and I suspect that's probably how they went from a 4 to 7, is they're evolving for more particular demands, more particular higher performance,
So the
lower cost.
7 one is more evolved.
That would be my guess, I don't know.
Well, actually, that's a great question. Let's pursue that. Why do they call it the Cisco Systems 7-layer
They're trying to push their products.
model of the internet? Why would Cisco go with 7 layers when the World Wide Web Consortium wants 4?
They got a hardware piece in there that they want to sell?
Could be that. It could be their hardware or their software they're trying to promote, the way that their software was written, and oh my gosh, the 4 layers model doesn't work well with this software, so we'll just invent a new set. Or it could be, we've got clients that we've funneled into our uses, and we want to keep them here, close to us? Does Microsoft do that? Does Apple do that? Do they corral users? As a matter of fact, is there, going on today, a war of the clouds? How, you know, we talk about the cloud as if it was a big monolithic thing. How many different clouds are there?
There's 7 types of clouds.
7 types. 7 layers. Does cloud have a layer? Yes, of course it does.
Yes.
How many can you name just off the top? Is Google a cloud?
Google's a cloud, Apple.
Is Apple a cloud? Does Microsoft have one?
Come up live.
Amazon.
All right, wait a minute,
Amazon
when
is a
you're
cloud.
saying that these are separate clouds,
They
that
are
they
separate
can't not
clouds.
enter each other's clouds?
That's it. If you are in iCloud, which is Apple's cloud, you can't save something onto Microsoft's or Google's or Dropbox, which is a cloud. All of the box applications are clouds. And what are they trying to do? They're trying to get us used to using them.
And then hit us with the big bill.
So, well, the other foot hasn't fallen yet. We don't know what the future marketing plans are of these people. Right now,
It's a razor and blades model.
yeah, it's pretty much
It's a
free.
what?
Razor and blades model.
We'll give you
I
the
thought you
razor.
said razor blades.
You
Did you say razor
Yeah,
blades?
well, it's a razor and blade model, so
Oh.
you get the razor for free,
Oh, yeah,
but you gotta
okay.
pay for the blades.
That's right.
I was thinking more along the lines of, let's see how many blades we can get in one razor. Kind of model. Let's see how many clients we can shove in one cloud.
We'll have,
I don't
we'll have
know.
to think about that. How many clouds can we have in eternity? Okay, so here's Cisco Systems, who seems to be promoting 7 layers for their compatibilities, for a lot of different reasons that we could, maybe it moves faster.
I was gonna say too, maybe they've identified some affordances of this system that would allow them to be first to market with something new.
Yeah, maybe what they're doing is building a foundation down in these layers that will allow them to make new innovation, you know, to better innovate in the future, ahead of their competitors,
With the iPad.
like Apple.
There is an implicit that with more layers, there's more functionality. If each layer is a function, wouldn't that mean that more layers is more functionality?
More layers is different functions grouped in different ways. Probably the better way to say it.
I mean, you also might look at it like just consolidating layers is kind of pragmatic at times, like for the physical layer, for example. From what I know, the data layer and the physical layer, and those are kind of hard to like pull apart. Like you have wireless, well, you're going to want a different data link protocol, 802N or whatever. So I mean, there's also some pragmatic considerations.
Everything has to fit. There is not just one internet. There are a bunch of little pieces that represent an internet. That means that the internet is a large and complex system of programs written by a lot of different people for special purposes. And you hope, one of the reasons that we can travel the internet is because someone else has already solved compatibility problems for us. BYU has solved a compatibility problem. Google Mail, Gmail, solves a compatibility problem so that we can have free access through the internet to other people. And we don't have to worry about, we don't have to select which transfer protocol we're going to use. But there was a time when those transfer protocols were much more visible to the user. We used to have to FTP files all the time because there was no web. What was the first real legitimate web browser? Can you remember? Probably before you guys were.
Netscape.
That's what I was gonna say.
Before Netscape, there was Mosaic.
I remember Prodigy when it came out. That was consumer.
And some of them have survived. Some of these browser systems, some of these internet connections have survived, some haven't.
Oh, it's just fun to sit in the class with all you guys.
Memorize this. This will be on the test soon.
Where's Stephanie?
Okay, so let's come back to Ms. Levy, because he is talking about something that's very close to instructional design. He has invoked the layers metaphor, hasn't he? The principle of layers in several different fields. He's trying to demonstrate that it has a reality, that it has traction. And here are the layers which Ms. Levy says exist when you design an assessment instrument. He says there's a domain analysis layer where you deal, the kinds of entities that you deal with are the concepts, the terminology, the tools, the analyses, and the information use that pertains to a particular test, or the subject matter in this case. The role, the function, this could easily, just as easily say function here. What happens within this layer? You gather substantive information about the domain of interest that will have direct implications for assessment. You study the subject matter structures. Now, those of you who have heard me talk about layering for instructional design before, that seems to correspond with one of the layers, one of the instructional design layers. Which one?
Oh,
Where you
wait.
study the structures of the subject matter, the domain of interest, which means the subject matter in this case.
Content.
It's the content layer. So Ms. Levy is saying that assessments have a content layer.
Although I feel like the way he's expressed this is a different use of layers than what you've designated.
Probably.
I'm thinking that there is a connection between the content layer and that domain analysis, but then if you look at domain modeling right here, you could also argue that that's also content, and maybe content and strategy layer from the way you're talking about it.
Actually, I would say it's talking about substantive information about the domain of interest that will have direct implications for the assessment, including how that information is learned and communicated. Yeah, it probably does. Okay? Now, there's more. Domain modeling.
How many does he have altogether? I've got to see the big picture.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Oh, good, that's a doable number.
It says 5 layers. Let's make it smaller so you can see them all at once. There they are. Now you can't read them, but that's okay. Domain analysis, domain modeling, where you actually describe the elements within the domain. So this is kind of overlaps with the content layer also.
Right.
Conceptual assessment framework, where you describe how you're going to approach the assessment itself. What kinds of structures are you going to deal with? Student evidence, task models, student model, observable and task model variables, rubrics, measurement models, test assembly specifications, and PADI templates, which is his own invention. He says, then there is a whole set of design questions, functions that have to be carried out, that have to do with the assessment implementation, which means how are we going to give this assessment? How is it going to be administered?
Okay, because now I'm seeing Addy / Brenda Bannon's ILD framework in this. He's moving from an analysis to design development to implementation. He's just missing evaluation here. So then my question to you is, are there layers evident in Addy and ILD?
There is a correspondence between layers, design layers, as I characterize them, and the ADDIE model.
There's a correspondence, but Addy is not expressed in terms of layers.
ADDIE is not expressed in terms of layers because it's expressed in terms of design process.
Right,
It's
okay.
an engineering model of instructional design.
See, I think what he's doing...
Layers is not a model of design. It's a set of tools for thinking about your designs.
Right, I see that this is a process laid out. That's a
Well,
layers and process, and I kind of struggle with that.
It may be. I don't know. I would say, yeah, he may be talking about a process here.
Just
Because all of those are verbs on his role.
right.
Yeah, delivery, well, assessment delivery.
If you look in roles, gather, express, implement, coordinate. And from my experience at this last AEA conference, there was a lot of hype about checklists and procedural.
But these are noun phrases over here.
And
Well,
the
that's-
key entities are also noun
Okay.
phrases.
Yes. And so he's talking about things, entities, objects, constructs, which exist within a layer.
So for him, the function, or for what you call a function, and he calls a role, means the action that's the layer is defined by the action that connects these key entities.
I would actually, if I had my druthers, I would say, this is what you do to design within this layer. When I talk about a function, I would put another column here that says, what are the functions that are carried out within this layer?
And function is not
It's
what
not
you
the
do.
same as a role. Your role as a designer is to gather and to express and to implement. Okay, I put another column in here that
So
says,
it's not that the domain analysis gathers substantive information. The role is what the people who are doing the assessment do when
That's
they're doing in the domain analysis.
yes, so that they can create a domain analysis which has the following functions that it can carry out. The following functions are served by this. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
It's-
the domain analysis acts on something and the people who are doing the analysis act on something.
Yeah. Now, that seems like really shaving the issue, shaving terms. It sounds really like a very fine difference, and the fact of the matter is, yes it is. Why? Why is that an important thing for us to be able to shave these differences? I wish Stephanie were here. She'd tell us, she'd
Have great examples.
she'd have some ready examples from engineering.
I don't have any examples from engineering.
Okay,
I was just gonna say that the finer your level of discernment, the more power you have to design and control, and
that's it.
the more power you have to enact your intent. And if design is intentional activity, like we've talked about, then discernment provides greater design power.
Yeah. There was a time when they talked about heat. Okay, Stephanie gave me a book on this very topic.
Yeah, she brought it.
And they didn't know the difference between heat and temperatures. They knew that that things had a temperature, but they didn't have the construct of heat. And yet, heat is the thing that they needed to know about. Temperature is just a temporary quality of something, as heat is, but they're different. And shaving that difference is what allowed them to make advances in thermodynamic theory.
You know, it's interesting because in one sense things are getting more elaborated, but isn't the opposite process also happening conceptually where you're coming up with a mental or a physical tool that simplifies your concept of a layer? Isn't that what Einstein was doing? Was saying, I'm going to show you that the layers you thought existed don't really exist. They're all in a one function.
Yeah, but if Einstein hadn't had his more complex categories,
He
if
wouldn't
he
have had his
hadn't-
questions.
what's that?
He wouldn't have his questions.
We wouldn't have his results if he hadn't been able to think more deeply about things. Basically what he did is he reframed the terms for us. He said, you're talking about time and space as if they were static things, as if they were continuous. He said, I don't think that's true. As you approach the speed of light, both time and space have plastic qualities. Time speeds up and space becomes warped at the speeds of light. And so he redefined the game, he redefined the terms, and because of that, we have an advance. Now, somebody's got to redefine the terms of design. Somehow we have to feel permission to do that, because right now we're kind of stuck in a loop where we're looking at least in instructional design, we're looking at it as a process, from a process perspective. And we've improved and improved, and we've moved the deck chairs around the Titanic about as many different configurations as we can. We've made boxes, we've combined boxes, we've split boxes apart, we've renamed boxes, we've allocated new functions, we've gone into new detail about these functions. But the thing is, they're still processes. They're telling us how to do processes. There aren't really new constructs emerging. There aren't really new ways of attacking design emerging. And so we need to be curious, John.
See, going back to the process versus the function, to me it seems like a process is over time, right? A process is set up so that there is this, first you do this, then you do this. The ADDIE model is a process model. First you do A, then you do D, D, I, D.
It's of a different kind, though. The ADDIE model is a kind of a more or less sequential process model, but the process is not very contingent. For instance, it tells me I should do task analysis, and then objectives analysis, and then media analysis. I mean, these things usually are mini models at least. And it's not a matter, if I do task analysis, it doesn't mean that I'm not going to do media analysis. It just means that that's the next thing that I do. In a process, in a true process, there's a contingent quality to it.
The rest
A
changes
conditional
based on
quality
the
that says,
first steps.
if you do this, then you look at what the situation is, and you may do this, or you may do this.
Right, and to me, that's the benefit of the layers analogy, is that the layers allows you to do that. Layers is not process, it's not a process model. It's
That's right.
fundamentally a different model.
It is.
Because
It's an
not
architectural
time
model.
dependent. The
Yes.
layers are separate enough that you can start on any layer,
Yeah.
maybe even on a house, you have to start on the structure first. But a true layer model is that you can start on any layer first, and it
Yes.
doesn't have to be the same process every time, the same sequence. And you can improve one layer over time, and you can exchange layer out, you can improve that one to improve the whole system.
Yes.
But it's fundamentally a very different model than the process model of time, sequence, do this. And instructional design, in my mind, is very still focused on the process
Yes.
side of
It is.
models, which is first do this, then you're done.
When you deal with instructional design layers, the way I think of it, you start by talking about the nature of the thing being designed.
It's descriptive.
Instead of the process that you're using to design it. You say,
Descriptive.
what is it I'm designing, and what functions does it carry out? Then you design those functions. Now, you make a good point, John. Let's go back to the Coventry Cathedral example. That was, we were on Patty.
No, the Google search there.
There's Coventry Cathedral. Now, when we take a look at this, is there evidence of a layered design in the Coventry Cathedral redesign, as it was redesigned? What did they choose as the most critical layer element in their design?
The altar.
The altar and the old ruined, the ruins of the old building. Every other design feature, and they did two things: the altar and the ruins. And second of all, what was the theme that they were going to connect it with? The Phoenix myth, the rising from the ashes. They combined those two, which really come from different layers. One is something about the conceptual basis for the design of this building. What's the major theme of this building? They combined that with a specific physical piece that had already been designed and was already in existence. And those two constituted the center around which everything else was designed, that got designed and built. Does that make sense? That's exactly what you were saying, John.
It's a recombination of layers instead of a process.
They picked two variables from different layers and used those to govern every other variable that was decided in the design. Now, do you think that the redesigner of the Coventry Cathedrals back in 1944, that I think they started talking about this, do you think that the Coventry Cathedral designer said, okay, now we've got some layers we're dealing with in our design here. We've got to Okay, what layers are there? Well, there's the altar layer, and there's the ruins layer, and there's the phoenix layer. Do you think, that doesn't sound plausible?
But they
Okay.
did probably, and that, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, they did probably say, here is our set of problems. How are we gonna solve them?
Yeah, how did they say the problem to themselves?
They probably said, this is a really important old church, but it probably is never gonna function that way again. So
And
what are we
so-
gonna do now?
And so they changed it from being a church into a,
Memorial.
so they redefined the structure, the purpose of the structure. It's a place to go to remember things now. And because, now, so, if they'd have been designing a church out of it, I mean, wouldn't they design a chapel and the transepts and the, you know, they'd have tried to restore it back kind of like it was, to its pristine condition. But because they were designing something different now, and they held certain things that were going to be constant. Instead of the transepts, the nave, and the chapel being held constant, as you would normally in a church, a chapel of that kind, they held only the altar and the myth constant, and everything else was designed around that. Does that make sense? Because they were designing something different, different things took priority in their design decisions. It wasn't important for them to design the chapel first anymore, or the transepts, or the glass windows anymore, or the height of the structure anymore. Other things took priority. Other structures had to be designed because the thing that was being designed was different. Does this suggest Krippendorf to you
Absolutely.
all of a sudden?
Well, it would be interesting for me to know, was it lacking structural integrity? Or was the decision to not rebuild it more along the lines of they didn't want to rebuild it because they wanted to have the memorial there?
I think that's what the thing is. It's very powerful. I'm trying to remember. I thought the inside of that new modern building was another church, but I guess I'm not remembering it correctly. But they wanted to leave it broken to remind people.
Yes,
Um,
a memorial. There's the new building. I'm sure that there's a chapel right behind this big wall.
yeah,
here.
yeah, that's my
I'll
memory.
bet
Is
you
they
there's
built
all
a
kinds
modern
of stained
church.
glass
So
here.
it's not like it's not a church anymore.
Yeah. And that's probably part of it, that's probably part of it, that's probably part of it. As a matter of fact, let's see. Does it give us, yeah, there we are. We're inside of it now. I think this is going to be, no, this is the new one. There it is. There's the new chapel. It's got its own altar. What if they'd have just torn down the old ruins and bulldozed the old altar? They would have just built a new church. But because they built the new church and left this as part of it, it was a whole different thing. Stop and think. The intellectual and the emotional goals for the newly designed thing, whatever you want to call it, memorial, were different from the original church. Now there was an added emotional effect they wanted. They wanted people to come and remember and be a little bit irritated and remember the people who sacrificed, the people who died, and all these kinds of things that we do at War Memorial. That was different from the original conception of the church. What they wanted people to remember when they came to that church was different.
But the ultimate effect is one of hope, because it is still, the old chapel, as this photograph shows, is still incredibly beautiful. And the bombs couldn't kill it. That's the image of the phoenix, is that what made that church cannot be killed, cannot be bombed.
That's a powerful idea. Okay, now, so here we are. Here's where we've arrived, I think, at this point in the discussion. And I really appreciate what you guys have been right on with your comments. this idea of layers, since the Coventry redesigner did not probably think in terms of layers, and yet we can identify the influence of layers as we retrospectively analyze this design now. Do layers exist or not?
No. I don't think they do. I think layers is an abstraction layered on top of reality to help us make sense of reality, but
To help us make sense of and
reduce the complexity so that we can act
so
within
that we can
reality.
design,
So we can design.
I would say. Yeah,
I don't think they exist though.
Well,
they exist in the mind of the designer.
I have two questions. When can I ask?
Well, you just asked one, so you only got one left.
I have a lot of questions, but
Walk
I'll
on.
wait my turn.
Go ahead, Sue.
Well, I'm thinking that, I'm trying to get my head around this, because the idea sort of expands, and the more you think about it, the harder it is to sort of capture it, you know?
That's, yeah.
So I'm trying to think about if these layers are, my first definition that I read when I read about them was that these layers were defined by a cluster of questions. So my question is,
That a designer was trying to answer, right?
right, so the question is, are the questions functions? And the second one is, how, I
Let's answer
don't
the
think
first
they're completely immaterial in the sense that, because you really are bound, running up against, it's a way of explaining a very real set of problems. So I'm wondering how you define your problems. Oh, and my second question is, are the problems related to each other? And do we understand how? Because when you're building this cathedral, somehow that human purpose brings all of those layers together, and it makes this very powerful
Yeah,
emotional and spiritual statement.
yes.
It all becomes one at some point. And so the questions are not unrelated to each other. It's not a series of one question after another. It is something is tying all these questions into a bundle. So my question is, are the questions functions? And number two, what's their interrelationship? And are the layers sometimes crisscrossing each other so
Yes.
that,
Okay, the first question, are the layers functions? No. They aren't functions. Excuse me, are the layers questions?
are the questions functions?
Excuse me,
Are the questions that
functions?
define the layers the function of the layer?
No. The functions are statements of what has to be accomplished by some divine design artifact. The questions arise in the mind of the designer who is trying to design that functionality.
Ooh. Don't have to say that about 3 different ways.
Okay, let's try to give it.
So was one question in this cathedral, did they ask the question, should we start from scratch, or should we keep it? Would that be a question?
The first question that they probably asked was, what do we want to do with this old bombed out hulk? They said, what function will it perform for society? We're about to spend a lot of money on this whatever, and bulldozing it would be the cheapest way. But what function could it provide for us if we didn't bulldoze it? Well, we could use it to warehouse things. We could put a roof over it and use it as a warehouse. That would deny the sacredness of the place and the sacrifice of the people. We could build it as a mall. That would certainly bring in some income to pay for the costs of it, but that would have the same effect. We could build a church beside it, which would make it an interesting historical site, or we could use it for the function of causing people, helping people to remember what had happened there. My guess is that's the function that they wanted out of all those others that I mentioned. Once they had decided that function, there were some questions. We want this function to be performed. Remember the dead, remember that we were attacked, remember the great destruction that took place here. on a sacred edifice deliberately. And once they had figured out that function, the next thing they had was questions. Well, how do we then use this to our advantage to carry out those functions? So design questions immediately started to arise. And answering those design questions in some tentative fashion made new questions, brought new answers, made new questions. And this is how design proceeds. You decide on the function that needs to be performed. You answer questions about how to perform that function, and new functions arise that you have to design. And so you answer those questions and new answers. And so it's a cascading process.
So is it organic?
Yes. That's why it can truthfully be said that instructional designers design systems. And they're not just built edifices. They are living, breathing, changing with their environment. And they have parts that function together. Does that make sense?
Well, the interesting thing about this particular, I mean, I've been thinking about this because I think layers is such a powerful way to talk about the three-first problem. I mean, that's originally what made it so fascinating to me. Because at the heart of the metaphor is a ambiguous function. And that's true here too. Their answer to the question, let's revere the past and celebrate the present. Let's perform two opposite things in, let's design to hold the ambiguity in stasis. That's what makes it organic and continue to live.
And let's tie into it our mythos also. Let's make it a place of rebirth, of resurrection.
And so I guess my thesis is, so this, I don't know how it fits into all design, but human design or learning design seems to be, if it is organic, it has to, the reason that the old models keep getting sterile and formalized and then break down is because they don't hold the inherent ambiguity or the inherent intentions that are opposite and the intentions need to be there and everybody wants to get rid of them, but an organic design incorporates them.
That's right. Multiple functions that can be served by the same thing. It somehow sits at the intersection of
Even opposite
purposes.
functions.
Yeah. Yeah. Keep going. You're on a roll. These are great insights. So I think you do understand. Now here's the thing. I'm not here to preach you the full doctrine of layers. You can see that I'm exploring it also. I'm coming to new understandings. That's one of the reasons why this class. I wanted to understand. I wanted to be challenged. I wanted questions. So you don't have to apologize when you ask questions.
What was your second question?
It was,
My second question is, what's the interrelationship, the holistic interrelationship of all the
Okay.
questions? And he answered that because he said it's an organic,
it is organic.
self-elaborating.
Well, and I was going to say, isn't that what layers is? The way you define those layers inherently or implied in those layers is the relationship between those layers.
That's right, but whenever I start thinking about layers in terms of human design, the layers always crisscross each other, and so that they aren't clean cut. They're not. You would like to think of them separated from each other, but some other layer is also intersecting in this. He talked about this design as bumping the reality, and whenever you think about design, there's always an intersection in the layer from the other layers that always
Some kind of limit or some kind of...
or changes it. It
Changes.
changes the direction of the flow. Maybe that doesn't make any sense, but.
I always think of the layers in terms of the old animation techniques where they've got the different panes of glass layered on each other. So they're layers, but you look at them all as one thing. And that's how I imagine they do interact and they form a coherent
Because you
picture.
can't see the whole picture without all the layers there. That's a
Yeah.
wonderful image.
It's not that you're taking this out and dealing with it completely in isolation. No, you have to deal with the whole thing.
The thing that unifies that, you're right, and that's a great point and a great question. The thing that unifies it for me is what Donald Schoen says in chapter 3, of educating the reflective practitioner. Okay, so here's what he says. He talks about a conversation that goes on during design. And it's not a conversation between people, it's a conversation between the designer and the problem. The designer looks at the problem and says, okay, there's some functions I've got to perform. I think Gesundheit. I think I could perform that function this way. That's a answering a design question, right? I think it could perform it this way. So let me put that up as a test hypothesis, as a design hypothesis. Could I design it this way? Would that work? And then Schoen says that the designer listens to the problem give feedback. The problems part of the conversation is, no, if you do that, then you've got to do this, and you've got to do this, and that's not going to work, given your resources, your time, your budget, your skills, your whatever, technologies. So, okay, the designer says, okay, I hear you. Okay, let me form another hypothesis. Given all the constraints on the problem, I can do this. And you send that out there as a hypothesis, and the designer appreciates the result. That's what Schoen says. You really need to read this chapter. I should have assigned it, but then nobody would read it. Now you'll be curious enough to go read it. You would read it though, Sue.
I did. I read the whole book.
Okay. All right, so you're aware of this conversation that he's talking about between the designer and the problem. And the designer keeps speaking to the problem with possible solutions, and the problem comes back and says, it wouldn't work that way. It wouldn't work the way you want it that way. And so this conversation goes on and on and on. Okay? That unifies this idea. One of the things that strikes me as being very important about taking a layered approach rather than taking a process-oriented approach is, number one, you can start where the most important elements of the problem are that have to be held constant, the altar and the ruins, and you build the design around that. Number two, you then gain a sensitivity for all the different approaches you could take to it. Instead of saying, what's the next step in the process I've got to do, you say, okay, once I've made that decision, what could I do? What other functions do I want this edifice to perform? Well, there probably needs to be a worship function here. So probably as a result of that, we've probably got to design a chapel of some kind. Okay, once you've decided to design a chapel of some kind, you say, okay, then what's it going to look like? How's it going to be oriented on the site? It becomes a building to design, doesn't it? But the building is just one part of a larger thing that you're designing. Is this making sense? Okay.
Isn't that basically Schoen's argument too? Which he says that theory is so apart from practice, or that education is apart from practice, and that a functional design, in my view, as you just described it, is much more like current practices in instructional design than ADDIE or than process models.
That's right. As a matter of fact, there's an article by Jane Dark, D-A-R-K-E. Let me see if I can, let's see if we can get lucky here. Come on, guy. Hello. Earth to, come on. Okay, somebody Google Dark, D-A-R-K-E, and
What's the first name?
Dark, Jane, and the rest of that Google term is primary generator. And I don't know why this isn't responding to me. Let's see if I get rid of this. It's not responding at all. Is it locked? I guess.
Primary generator in the design process.
Primary generator in the design process. Does it have the article there or just a citation? You should become familiar with this article of Dark's. Okay. Dark says that when we're designing, we like to think that we're using these rational top-down processes, the systematic analysis, synthesis process. But she says what actually probably happens more often during design is that the designer early on gets some kind of a design hypothesis in mind. I could make it look like this, or I could make it one of these. And then the designer goes into a cycle of testing that hypothesis against the several different options that it opens up. That is this conversation that Sean is talking about. I get an idea in mind, it could be a memorial. Okay, so is there anything that will disprove now that it can be a memorial or that it could be designed in a certain way? Advanced design hypotheses. But Dark talks about this concept of a primary generator. What's a primary generator? Let me, since you haven't had time to read the article, and don't try to read it now, you'll get really confused trying to listen and read at the
I'm
same
not
time.
trying to read it, I can't even find it.
Okay, well, I'll get it to you, don't worry. The idea of a primary generator is exactly the altar of Coventry Cathedral. It's the one thing that all the other design decisions are going to revolve around.
The operational principle.
It is. Except I haven't introduced that term into this conversation, but yes, it is. It's the operational principle. Don't worry about it right now. You'll get it during this course. But it is, as far as the discussion today goes, it is the one item within one layer, one decision within one layer that's been made that forces decisions at other layers. Does that make sense?
That's significant, because that's where the designer can maintain his design in that conversation. That's where the designer has power over that design, right?
Yeah.
Instead of the design taking over itself, or the design taking over the conversation.
Why does she call it the primary generator? Why does she call it the primary generator?
Because it generates many possible
It
features.
generates the possible futures for the design. Anything that doesn't fit with that primary generator, so long as she maintains that primary generator, anything that doesn't fit with that generator isn't going to be considered as part of the problem. Now, there may come a time where the designer says, you know, it's just not going to work. It can't be a memorial. There's not enough left. Or for some reason, they discard the idea that it's going to be a memorial. They say, okay, then what is it I'm designing? And they form this new commitment, and then they start testing that. Okay? That's what Dark says in this article. It's the primary generator because it generates the possibilities, just like John said. It generates the possibilities for what the design could become, for what will be allowed into the design, for what won't be allowed into it. Now, are you guys in want of a break? Or shall we keep going?
I would like a break.
Let's take a 10-minute break. Let's come back when the big hand is on the 6th, shall we? Just to review, probably the best way would be for us to go around the room and get a brief comment from each one of you. What was an important idea that we talked about while we were talking?
We better start over there. Just because I'm gonna have difficulty
Okay. John, what was the most important part for you?
You know, it was being a good listener.
Well, we talk about architecture and like the cathedral, we put that example, and we talk about how architecture uses layers to design.
Even when the designer doesn't intend to use them,
Right.
a design emerges, and that's something we'll talk about.
Talked about the network layers and how Cisco has 7 layers, but the W3 has like 4 layers, and how they're different, but kind of the same too.
Okay. Jay?
Yeah, I thought one great thing we talked about was the interaction between the layers happens as the designer has a conversation with the problems inherent.
Shows conversation.
Yeah. So we were trying to figure out how these layers connect, how they interact, and at that point it seems to be important.
We talked about how Donald Schoen, in educating the reflective practitioner, talks about designs being a process between a designer and a problem. And this is being recorded too, so you don't have to worry about taking notes too much. The designer poses a possible solution and then listens to what the problem says back, and then poses another solution and then listens. And through this conversation, the solution is refined in many different steps and stages. Okay, John, any?
I really like the idea of the distinguishing process from function. I think that a functional design, I don't want to say process, a functional design approach really allows the designer, I think, to have more control over the design. To say this one factor is going to affect multiple different layers in this way, and I'm going to design around that. Instead of a process model, I think what happens is they start out with well intentions, but because it's a process, they paint themselves into a corner.
They're swept along to the next step, whatever that's going to be.
The
example that we used in this, John, was Coventry Cathedral, which was bombed out during World War II. And there were just ruins left, but it was most of the forepart of the walls of the cathedral, maybe 2 walls, and an altar. And they had to decide what to do with this. Were they going to bulldoze it and get rid of it? Or were they going to try to somehow resurrect it? And they decided to resurrect it as a memorial to the war dead, to brutality. And they also wanted to use the resurrection theme, and so they combined this altar and the remains of the chapel with the phoenix metaphor, the phoenix mythos, which is a bird rising from the ashes. And they created this resurrected place, which is now the old, bombed out ruins, plus a huge new church that replaces the old one. But it's more than church now. It's a place to go to remember. Okay. The interesting thing is that they chose the remaining walls and the altar as the central design element first. And everything else was designed around it. They held those things constant while everything else was allowed to vary. And that's what important John's commitment. Kevin, did you have anything you wanted to add? No. Okay. Keith?
The whole time we were talking about this, I was
Keith,
thinking, we have this like great parallel to this with the tabernacle that just got burned out.
Yeah.
They're redesigning that whole thing, and so we're gonna have our own Coventry temple as
A temple. It's
Yeah.
not just a tabernacle anymore.
right.
It's something bigger and larger. Okay.
It'll be neat to see.
Now, by the end of our time here, we want to talk about each of the design layers, because that's what Sue is anxious for us to get to. What are they and how do they function? Before we get to there, I want to give you this reading. You were saying, Sue, is something which is designed organic? And my response to you was emphatically yes. Emphatically yes. What designers design are living things, systems. We use the word systems, but we don't actually keep that metaphor in mind and all of its implications. We design courses, multimedia, websites. Websites, that's a frozen thing. Even if you got a database and you like Amazon, you're generating, it's not Instructional designers design systems. From the very first, that's been what we designed.
When you say systems, could you also say environments?
Systems that live within environments.
Okay.
And are influenced by them and adapt to those environments. That's what makes them organic.
Whoa, 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 whoa. Can you say that slower so we can
Sure.
write that?
Well, it's all on tape now, or it's in digits.
Can you back that up and see that?
Systems live within environments. And they interact with those environments. They're influenced by the environments, they influence the environment. They adapt, they change according to the environmental circumstances. And that's what we're going to talk about now. We're going to talk about slime mold for a minute. And you're going to say, whoa, this is heavy stuff to be getting in an instructional design course. This is, if you do a Google search on slime mold architecture, this will come up. The biologic architecture would be one of your choices. It's a PDF. You can download it. It's by a professor, associate professor of architecture at Clemson, who's going to talk about slime mold and lichen. You say, whoa, architect. Okay. Here is the whole idea. I'm going to get the slime mold thing up. Okay. As a matter of fact, dang. Oh, it's back. The computer's back. This is wonderful. Okay, wait. What can I do with it now? Can I take it to a new place? Slime mold video. Tell me I can do this. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Okay, we're going to watch a video for a second.
Never trust technology.
I'd use it.
Skip this ad. How do I skip the ad? How do I tell it? I get.
Like for 5 seconds, and then button come up.
Okay. So it's inevitable. Am I going to Hunger Games? I'm going to have to watch Hunger Games. Wait, I think it's frozen again. It's not doing anything. Never trust a computer. Never trust a computer.
Oh, now you are going to watch the Hunger Games.
How do I get out of it?
You close it and go back.
How,
Just close on the X there.
how can I? Where's the X?
Oh, at the top.
Small.
There you go.
No,
That?
next
To
to
the left. There.
Okay, so now what can I do?
Click on the play button.
Play. I did and it didn't. We're going to see the theatrical trailer. How do I get past it?
You.
How do I skip it?
Right there.
Yes, thank you.
Can't you just,
Yes! Victory over technology. Okay. Now, there's a guy. You'll see from the title. You'll be able to see it. I don't have to explain it. Does that help? Okay. We're playing.
Yeah, I could see it.
Playing. There we go. These are little amoeba-like structures. When food gets scarce, they start to come together. of slime mold, it goes through this cycle. These are the diagrams of the cycle. It builds this body. When it runs out of food, it forms into a kind of a spiral form. It forms the body, and then it moves to where food is. If where it moves to, there's plenty of food, it separates out into individual organisms again, the ones that are still alive. If there is not enough food for them, the rest of it dies, and spores are formed from what that's fruiting body, what's called the fruiting body, and they go out and create new little amoebas, which then repeat the whole cycle again. That's why they're everywhere. Okay, now, what's the value of this idea? That's a living system, an organic system. This guy from Clemson, Green, says you've got individual people who need living spaces. Those living spaces can be mobile, but they can also become stationary, and they can also aggregate into larger and larger units. He's talking about what's the comparison between the slime mold cycle and the cycle of a living system which is organic, which can change over time and adapt to needs. You say, well, that's kind of far out. But what it leads to is the architecture of these living units, first of all a mobile living unit, and then aggregating into larger and larger units.
I'm just thinking Wall-E this whole time we're talking about this.
Wall-E, yes. Yeah, by and large. And to larger and larger, more permanent units. But it does it modularly. Now you see much more of this in Europe than you see here in the US. But here's the interesting thing. There is that little cube in the center represents the basic structure of one of these little units. Everything else represents a modular part of some kind that represents an option for connection to other units. Okay? Now, this is an aggregable unit, a modular unit. Okay? Now, it happens to be for housing. What kinds of modular units do we have in our lives today that we use, that we purchase, that we put up on eBay? What modules inhabit our lives today? I mean, this is very futuristic. I mean, most of us wouldn't live in one of these because we're used to something else.
They sell prefab homes that you can do this with. I've seen them put two together,
And they call those modular housing, don't they?
yes.
Okay, so that's one thing that we have today. Houses that can be assembled on the spot. So that idea is not so foreign to us. What other modular products might there be today that we would be familiar with?
Computers.
Describe computers.
There's a lot of little parts that go together and make a computer, and there's a screen module, there's a mouse module, there's thousands of modules in reality. There's as many as you can think of.
So if I don't like the keyboard, if I don't like the Dell keyboard that comes with my computer, can I unplug it and plug in an Apple keyboard, which I like a lot?
Yeah.
Okay. If I don't like this screen, can I add on another screen?
Yes.
If I want more memory, can I add on a hard disk drive, external unit? Or how many different configurations of portable memory are there between computers? Chips, hard drives, thumb drives, which are just chips. Sue?
Is that because computers were developed sort of ad hoc?
No.
And each new technological advance
No.
needed to kind of be able to communicate with a little bit older system?
Exactly the opposite, in fact. The first computers were monolithic designs. Now, there's a book I want you to read. The next book I want you to read, okay? It's called Design Rules. Design
Baldwin and
Clark.
Clark.
Yes. The Power of Modularity is the subtitle of the book. John's read it. John, tell us what it's the story of. Tell us about design rules.
It's a detail that answers your question perfectly, in fact. It goes through an in-depth history on the modularization of the computer design. And it goes, so it starts at the very beginning when there wasn't layered, it wasn't modulars, it was not in a format where you could change keyboards or change screens. It was all built in-house, and one change meaning you had to start over from scratch. And that's how it started, and it describes in detail how that changed to a very modular design. All the way through, I think, early 80s, or late 70s, I think is that first volume.
So it used to be that if you had a computer and it didn't perform the functions that you wanted, or it was too small, you had to buy a whole new computer system. You couldn't save any of the pieces from the old computer, and you had to buy a whole new system. And that made IBM very happy, because that meant you had to buy their new printers and their new terminals and their new equipment and their new software that only worked on that computer, and their new memory and whatever. Then IBM started a project. They wanted to design not just one new computer, but a whole family of computers at once. It's called the 350 family.
Yeah.
That's right, the 360s. 36050 is one of the models. There's a 36040, a 36050, a 36060. You see where this goes? It's a family of computers, different sizes, different capacities, different extents, but the same basic architecture. As this happened, have you heard of the Mythical Man Month? That article about the Mythical Man Month? A guy named Fred Brooks wrote that. Well, Fred Brooks was the lead designer on this 360 computer design project. And he said, in order for us to design a family of computers, it's going to have to be built in modules. They're going to have to be modules which perform certain functions. And the modules are going to have to be attachable and detachable so the system can grow. That's exactly what's being talked about here. There are modules, and then there are options, and you can connect modules together that perform different functions, and the thing comes together like a slime mold into an organism that works. So it's a system design that's designed in terms of individual modules. Does that make sense?
Now, the reason they were talking about architecture is because that happened to be the domain in which these people work. But this could equally be applied, the metaphor of the slime mold could be equally applied to education, instructional design specifically.
Yeah. Can you give us an example?
I think this classroom is an example. We could each be learning about this topic on our own, but we've come together because food is scarce.
The slime mold. You slimes.
And ultimately, after this class is over, we are going to disperse and try and find new
Find
sources.
other food.
Yeah. At least that's the hope, right?
Now, here's the interesting thing. It wasn't just IBM that profited from this. If IBM hadn't done this project, and if Brooks hadn't come up with this modular design idea, stop and think. We've all had tower computers, and some of us still do. If you take off the cover of this computer, what's inside the computer?
Motherboard, hard drive.
There's a motherboard, which contains the processor chip, the hard drive,
The fans.
the fans, the power supply,
Video card,
sound card, memory, okay? And it's built in such a way that the boards that contain, each board performs a certain set of functions, doesn't it? By the way, where did Where, in the personal computer, where was the first place that modularity of functions started splitting apart? Can you remember?
And
Was
processing.
the CPU
Yeah.
process?
This,
What brand of computer was it that first made a modular computer system?
Is it Dell?
That doesn't ring, what was it?
Dell?
Dell, no, way before Dell. Dell wasn't even born probably on that. Apple. What does the Apple I look like? Let's do some exploring here. So you guys know where to
Those of
find
us who are old enough to,
Apple I. Apple I picture. No. That's, I don't want a picture of Apple. Apple I. Oh, I see. I see why I did it wrong. Apple I. Picture. Apple I. Result of development efforts of, okay. There's the Apple I as it was originally built. Here's with the top on. Kind of unglamorous, but it's all one big board. There's a better picture of it somewhere. Apple iPhoto. No, that's going to sell me a product. Stop it. Apple I picture.
If you go up to the top to images, it will.
Images. Images. Now, Apple I. From Google. Well, there's one. There's one that's way stripped down, and you can see the working innards. These are museum pieces now, valued hugely. Okay, there you can see the board. One big board. Now, what happened in the Apple II? Did it give me Apple II?
no, I give you Apple I picture too.
Apple II picture. Apple II, let's look inside the Apple II. And it's still one big board. Maybe it was the Apple IIe where it started getting fractured out. Let's look at Apple IIe. At one point in Apple's history, they ran out of Apple II history. What do you think?
Sure.
What's our chance? Apple II series. Let's see. I think I'd have my media prepared it maybe smooth. Okay, let's go one more time. If we don't get it this time, we'll give it up. Apple II series. Wikipedia knows all, sees all. Apple II, there you go. There are separate boards. Okay, Apple II, what is that, an Apple II? That's not an E, that's just an Apple II. Okay, so separate boards. You see the little places, the expansion slots in there? That was very big news. And pretty soon, that was a 64K machine. Commodore was building one. They built the PET. Atari was building a 64 machine that you could drop things into. You could drop things into the modules. You could drop them in. You could configure your computer the way you wanted to. Nowadays, when you order a Dell online, you order the little tiny pieces parts, and they assemble them for you after you have ordered the computer. That's a modular design. Okay? Now, if you wanted to buy a truck and you were interested in a Scandinavian truck, you would go to Scania and you would find out that they had a componentized truck design where you can order a truck in the same way that you can order a Dell computer. Does that make sense? You order the engine, you order the cab type, you order, whatever. Some combination of things that fits your particular need, the size of the cargo area.
But then you have to wonder where each component is coming from and the quality of those components.
Scani is a pretty good name, has a good reputation. We deal on reputation in modular products, don't we? Dell, you can trust. Some brand names, you're not sure, you can trust. Okay, but the point is, we live in a world where things are becoming modularized. Now, the point of Baldwin and Clark's book on design rules is that in the design of a complex system, you have to modularize. Eventually the system grows so big and so complicated that you can't design the whole thing as a monolith anymore. And that's where IBM was getting with its computers. You couldn't design them big like that anymore. Okay. So the people who have gotten the idea of modularity and did it well could stay in business. And the people who didn't get the idea or didn't do it well are not in business anymore, or else who had a bad business plan. Okay, now.
So what happened to YCAP?
The YCAT system sold itself. Yeah. We used to have an association with that famous company. Okay, now, here's the dilemma. Okay, let's just talk about instructional design layers now. Let's turn off the bubble machine here. You guys know that we're here to talk about the layers of an instructional design. That means that we are considering the nature of the thing being designed, the properties of that thing being designed, the functions that are carried out by the thing being designed. And we're going to use that as the basis. This is my hypothesis now, okay? This is the theory. You can approach a design by thinking in terms of its layers. Even though the Coventry Cathedral people didn't approach it in this way, they could have. In that Gene Dark article that we talked about, where they were trying to figure out this idea of primary generator, you'll see that what she did in there was she interviewed a number of architects who had designed huge housing complexes in Europe, trying to find out how they went about getting the idea for their design. They were on different locations and different places with different cultures and different SES, and they were trying to figure out what the designers did, how they went about doing their design. Did they follow the step-by-step process engineering model, or did they just go through a process of analysis, synthesis? Did they do that? How did they go about their design? And they found out that neither of those turned out to be a correct description of how designs evolved. What happened was they did this thing that's called finding a primary generator. Finding one commitment, one design element that's going to be a certain way, a vision of the product, as it were.
How do you find that?
And designing everything. There's an interesting
I mean, I would suspect that as we become better layered designers, that skill of finding that primary generator becomes as important, if not more important, than our ability to design the rest of the layers based on that primary generator.
That is exactly what Dark comes to the conclusion of. Let's see. Did you guys find it online here?
I couldn't get the full text though.
You can't get full text. And
Okay.
BYU's library database is down.
Okay. Oh, bummer. Okay, then let me tell you what her conclusion was that she reached. She said, one of the problems with inexperienced architects, and you can say designers in any field, is that they don't have enough of these generators that they're familiar with. They don't have enough basic patterns that they're familiar with.
Well, wait, whoa. She said they don't have enough basic generators?
That's right.
So what does she conceive of as those basic generators?
They are basic ideas, basic patterns about how something could be achieved, how a function could be carried out.
Wow. Not enough of them?
Yes. You'll see when you read the article. The idea being that an experienced architect has a larger store of design patterns. Okay? Patterns that can be incorporated into a design, arrangements, configurations, whatever you want to call it. Okay?
Is that through experience or what, you know? How are they, how is an experienced
doesn't-
designer get more generators?
The name of this article is The Primary Generator. It was written by Jane Dark, D-A-R-K-E with an E on the end. The Primary Generator. I know it's in the library. I know you can get it through interlibrary loan. Okay, and I have a copy of it. Actually, I have a copy of it already made, if you'd like, for you. The point, she didn't say how these generators are learned, but she said that they accumulate with experience in designing. Now here's a key that I would use to understanding how these are accumulated. There is a video online which is available to you called IDEO on Design. It's called The Deep Dive. That's what it's called. The Deep Dive. It's a segment from, what's the name of the program?
NBC Nightline.
Nightline.
Yeah, you just some things.
Yeah. Now you can watch that video. There is a point in there at which they just give fleeting, passing, oh, is it in the video or is it in the book? It's in the book, The Design of
The Art of Innovation.
Art of Innovation by Tom Kelly. He talks about on rollers, there is this case, this cabinet, it's like a tool chest that they keep at this design place called IDEO. He said all that's in there is things that work. Not big things, not whole machines. But he says there are hinges, there are different kinds of clasps, there are little mechanisms that work. And when a designer gets high-centered, doesn't have a good idea how to proceed, they'll go play around with this thing. Okay, ooh, that's cool. Okay, got it. Okay, that's a great idea, and can maybe break the dam.
The other thing is they have a lot of people with different expertises working together, and they can share these different primary generators.
Yeah.
I thought they were using it because they were making these rapid prototypes, and they were just going and grabbing stuff from the drawer to put some idea together to show it.
They're using them to abstract ideas from.
Wow.
So they would look at a Jelly Belly and see something different than a Jelly Belly. They would look at this case and see something different from this case. They'd see all the ooh, the hinge, the movable hinge, that's cool. Now, you say, how does that help you in designing a toothbrush or a new car or a new TV monitor? Well, it all works together somehow. And they get ideas by seeing other ideas that have worked. They browse ideas. Okay. Now, you can use, Dark says that you can choose any part of a design, and you can use that as the primary generator for your design. If you told me you have to create an instructional design which incorporates Jelly Bellies, could I do that? It has to incorporate Jelly Bellies somehow. Could I create an instructional design that incorporates Jelly Bellies?
We do it with M&Ms when we're teaching kids how to graph.
Did they for instance, okay, let's go back now. The answer is
Is that question a primary generator, or is that?
not, it's not a primary generator, but we're gonna get to the primary generator in a second. The Jelly Belly would be the primary generator. Just like in the redesign of the Coventry Cathedral, the altar and the existing walls were the primary generator around which everything else was constructed and designed. Does that make sense, John? They kept one part, they held one part stationary and made everything else adjust to it.
I want to say too that their understanding of the way they conceptualize the primary generator is largely what gives rise to the rest of the design. That altar, I'm sure they didn't just see an altar. I would go there and I would see an altar, but for people that were there when it happened, they would see so much more. It was more of a primary generator for them than me.
That's
because
right.
of the way they conceptualized
It was a symbol of something much more.
Yeah.
So designs not only have organic qualities, they have symbolic qualities. Okay. So if I was designing an instructional system that involved Jelly Bellies, certainly the Jelly Bellies would be involved in the reward system, the M&M's principle. But I'll bet you I could actually, I could create little scientific experiments with Jelly Bellies. I could create discovery exercises with Jelly Bellies. I could create memorization experiences about Jelly Bellies. I could create process lessons about how Jelly Bellies are made that could teach people about how things are made. There's a million different ways that I could hold this constant. I could teach science lessons about using Jelly Bellies. What's inside of them? How many different chemicals are there in a Jelly Belly?
How's it digested?
I saw an advertisement one time for orange juice, Florida orange juice. And it was listing, it was kind of our orange is healthy for you. And it was talking about, it had a list, and it was a full page, and it was small print of all the chemicals inside of an orange. I mean, 2,5-diethyl triethylene morochlorate, and it was just one right after another, all these very complex chemicals. Oranges, natural substances, contain a huge variety of chemicals. Jelly Bellies, how many chemicals are inside of a Jelly Belly? You could create experiments. You could create research projects around Jelly Bellies. You could create an instructional product that used that had the one uncompromised element of its design was a Jelly Belly. It had to be there somewhere.
So, when my daughter was applying to BYU, she applied to the Hinckley Scholarship, and the question for the essay was, describe how you eat jelly beans. And she wrote the essay that got her in.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, see? Okay, now, so here's the problem when you're approaching layers as they're related to instructional design. How do you make the case that layers has value to an instructional designer?
You evaluate their design for them and say, it could be a little better than it is.
How do you measure better?
Well, you have to start out with a predefined set of criteria.
Okay.
Even by people's objective standards that they use to evaluate their own instruction, you can always find room for improvement.
Yeah.
And so you start with what they have.
Yeah.
And then from there, if you understand layers, you can introduce new layers and say, did you think about this?
Yeah.
And how might it change your design? You have to do it gently.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. You've probably been there, I would say.
Is it that obvious?
Maybe one of the ways you can evaluate it is whether the layers are working together. You know, So if you have one layer that's kind of contradicting another layer, it's gonna show up in the design, and you can say, you know, this part of your design doesn't quite work because you're trying to do this with this layer and this with this layer, and those are contradicting each other.
Workable designs, effective products, okay? But see, people who design without layers can still argue for effective designs, or workable designs, and effective products.
Then you have a design competition and you set objective criteria and you say, okay, we're gonna measure how fast you can do this and how effective the end product is gonna be. And then you do these comparison studies.
Does that make design layers compelling? Is that gonna make everybody rush out and start using design layers in their instructional designs?
Oh,
No.
it will have to happen. Because this whole idea about emerging technology is, you can watch it happening because the whole intrusion into business into creating designs is going to force this modularization. Computer technology is forcing this modularization already. You can see that there are companies that are just designed to give tests, and you can see that it's going to be, and all these different customers, homeschoolers and now online schools are going to say, all we want is we want this lesson on biology because we're going to couple it in these different ways.
And Khan Academy gives it to you.
Academy is great, and so and individual users are, there's so much information on the internet that people don't know how to access because they don't know how to learn from it, and so pretty soon people are going to say, oh, there's a lot of money just in us modularizing all this internet for individual customers. It's an incredible emerging market.
That's
And
right.
so it's not whether our design is better than you, it's coming. And
You're saying it's an economic argument. To stay in the market, to stay in the educational marketplace in a big way, there's an economic argument
you
for
have to be able to
modularization.
see it. You have to see
Okay?
units, small units that are deliverable quickly.
Now that's an argument that
Are you talking about commercial education?
I'm saying any kind of instructional design at all. John?
What's compelling to me about layers is as you design, from a designer's perspective, as you design and you come across a problem, using layers you can quickly decompose the problem and find the solution quicker, I think, than if you're
So you would say speed of design.
speed of design, efficiency of problem solving, that kind of
Okay. All right. How else do you argue this idea of layers? How many, one idea is not held in place by one benefit, one value.
I think one of the values to me in layers is that you have to think about choices that you make. Like you're more conscious of designing and of the choices that you're making when you're designing.
Of which design decisions you have to make. Okay? So, if you talk about the function of the entire product, you have to answer questions about how to design that overall function. But if you talk about the product as having several sub-functions that have to occur, that brings up new questions that you have to design to. You have to answer as a part of your design, okay? So it increases your awareness of the design questions to be answered, would be a way. How much of an argument has to be made for an idea like this in order for it to stick to the side of the barn?
You're talking about the S-curve of innovation that was discussed in our last seminar.
Yeah, say more.
I've watched similar presentations in the last few days, so you have to forgive me if I misquote, but there are, I think it was 6% of the people are innovators, and they're doing new things. There's about 10% of the people that are early adopters because they just want to jump on the bandwagon. Then there's a 34% of the people that want to get into this but not be the first to market, and then there's the cautious majority, just the other 34%, and then you have the laggers at the end. So,
And the non-adopters, yeah.
and the non-adopters. And so the idea is that you really have to focus your energy converting the accepting majority, and I don't know that you can do that without mass adoption from this early group, the early adopters. You have to get people using it to
Well,
get the idea
what
out.
arguments do you use for the adopters? There's one set of arguments that you use for early adopters. There are some people, John?
I'm thinking of it along the lines of like an open source programming language. So how does an open source programming language gain traction? Well, you basically have to convince the programmers to use it.
Mhm.
And then they develop their community, and then they can talk about it in the terms that are within the language, and if it's, plus it has to be, I think, associated with some kind of technological advance, like the iPad. Now you have all these programming languages that will then push stuff to the iPad as well. And, it's that sort of a thing when you're talking about like a design methodology or something.
But how do you make that programming language attractive to the point where a community can be built around it? What does it have to offer? And what kind of justification does there have to be for it? Now, we're talking in marketing terms now, but I think there is a level of terms above just pure market appeal.
I think that the market appeal is only a manifestation of increased choice. And I think people like choice, and there is an energy in magnifying their choices and designs that are layered in, and so that the user themselves is the one who's putting it together.
I'm going to keep driving this conversation deeper and deeper. What you guys are saying is useful and it's accurate, but I don't think, I want for us to reach rock bottom. Why? I mean, layers is different from a process-oriented approach. There has to be some reason why a person would want it. What are the affordances? What does it offer? What does it have to offer? For instance, when Bob Gagne wrote his book, The Conditions of Learning, and that overcame the whole instructional technology, educational technology field, and has become like a classical work, what did it offer that wasn't there before? And we could be talking about layers, we could be talking about any other innovation in design or whatever. What does an innovation, a new idea, have to offer in order to cause a paradigmatic change? Keith?
I wanted to ask a different question along the same lines, but ask what you're asking in a different way, and that is, what would prevent someone from using layers? What are the impediments to someone using layers theory?
Oh, there's a million. Number one, it's complex. You can't tell the layers apart. They're fuzzy. And people are used to having things nice, well-defined categories. Number two, it's kind of an egghead solution. I mean, I can follow a process without a great deal of training. I can't use layers to advantage unless I'm involved in designing all the time, every day. There are a lot of reasons why a person wouldn't want to.
I think understanding those reasons and then removing those concerns or resolving those concerns would help people adopt it. When you're talking about Gagne, I think that there weren't enough reasons for people not to use his ideas. It simplified what was already happening, it offered something that wasn't there previously,
What did it offer?
a step-by-step process where it reduced the complexity of the process down to 9 manageable events or considerations.
Well, this was kind of back to this, what is progress? So I would say if layers can help us in these areas, then progress.
So let me borrow yours for a second. You guys remember this? Do you have, any of you have it with you? These issues that we brought up in the very first class. The question that was being asked in this was, what represents progress? We've got a couple of them here. Jay scanned his. What represents progress? And we were trying to scope out what kinds of things. We're designing instruction now. There are a lot of designers worldwide who are just really happy with using everything that we know right now, and they don't feel the compulsion to move from what we have now to anything different.
Why?
Because because it works. And if it works, don't fix it. There's this concept of an energy low in chemistry. Okay? You can, if you've got, sometimes you put two materials together, two chemicals, and they come together explosively and until they reach a point where there's no more reaction going on. Then you can put a little flame under the chemicals, and you can cause them to react a little bit more, this time not explosively. And it's this concept of energy low. Things get caught into an energy low, a condition of stasis. Okay? Homeostasis. A human body, our body is a living organism, and it gets caught in a certain way, acting a certain way, behaving a certain way. So if you've got, you see I'm wearing my funny tennis shoes today. There's a reason for it, because yesterday I wore my brown grown-up shoes, and because this hip is higher than this hip on me, when I wear grown-up shoes, this hip starts getting sore and arthritic. Weird, huh? But these shoes don't do that to me. So I wear these shoes whenever I get the chance. Now, my body has settled into, because of the way it's constructed, it's settled into a certain way of responding and acting to different shoes that I wear. And over a period of time, there was a period of time when I was wearing different shoes and I didn't have comfortable shoes, good shoes. I've already had to have an operation on one foot to overcome the effects of wearing those shoes on that foot. Why? Because this hip is higher. Okay? If I continued to wear the other shoes, my body would continue to act in a way that responded to those shoes. It would find its homeostasis.
Sounds like the education system to me.
It would find its energy low. Yeah, that's where the education system is today.
But the only problem is with this energy low. In chemistry it might work because we're talking about static elements. Their properties essentially don't change.
We're talking about systems. We're talking about systems.
But you said yourself that systems exist within environments, and environments are not static. Does that make sense? Because environments are dynamic, then your stasis can only last so long. So our education system, though it's settled into a lull, can't remain there forever, hence the barrage of legislation coming down to affect stasis.
Trying to jar it out of its adding a flame.
Right.
Well, okay, then that's exactly the point we're trying to make, isn't it?
Right.
That if you heat it, it will eventually get to the reaction point and go into a new energy low.
But, well,
a new comfort zone.
I think that's a very positive way of talking about the impact of the legislation on our education. I think it's like
Well, it depends on,
it's like what they do makes it worse, and how people are responding to it makes it worse. It's like a negative cycle.
okay, so here's the thing. As change occurs, if we are capable of bringing about change, what represents progress?
Well, you can argue progress is in the right direction, but in the negative direction as well.
That's a two-dimensional drawing. Real systems are very dynamic.
Right. But that's the thing, when you talk about progress, are you talking about direction or a vector quality with both direction and magnitude?
Well, we're talking about instructional technology, instructional design technologies, and what will represent progress in the future. Now, in order for it to be progress, it has to be commercially viable, it has to be feasible, it has to be sustainable, it has to be manufacturable. Does it have to be adaptable? Scalable? Does it have to be scalable so that more users? Does it have to be more palatable than it is now? More accessible? More portable? For progress, okay, let's take that one feature. Do designs have to become more portable these days? Instructional designs? How many different places can I get instruction these days? Here? Here?
Instruction or good instruction?
Instruction. How many different places can it be marketed to me?
Lots. Lots of different ways.
Here, there, at home. So, is it going to be a benefit in the future are these going to stay the way they are? No. Is this going to stay the way it is? No. Is portability going to be a value in the future? Is it going to represent progress?
I think all of these will.
Palatability, accessibility, efficiency of design, efficiency of production, of use, cost versus value.
But the progress might be minimally incremental.
So are we trying to say that the layers way of designing is increasing some or all of these things over, say, the ADDIE way of design?
I'm wondering, that's a two-part question. The second part is it trying to demonstrate superiority over ADDIE? No. Because it's compatible with ADDIE, and ADDIE doesn't go away. The question I'm asking is,
So
what?
you're not talking about a political problem of how to get people to adopt it.
I'm talking about what, yeah, I am actually, in a way. Only not a political problem. I'm trying to say, what would represent, I'm trying to say this. If you had a new way of doing things, how would you have to argue? What is the value proposition of that new way that would cause it to be adopted? What I'm trying to do is to get you to the point of challenging this idea of layers. Maybe Keith's question was the right one. Why wouldn't layers be a good idea? Well, I've tried to think of as many as I could. And I didn't bring them all up. How would something like layers represent an advance? Here's why I'm asking the question. There are a lot of different ways that I could approach selling this idea of layers, writing about this way of layers, this idea of layers. I could talk about how it describes design processes at a more detailed level, so it gets you inside of the designer's mind. Would that be a value added? Yeah, to some designers it would. I could say that, well, layers happen anyway. Layers aren't something that I've invented or that anybody else has invented. We've seen enough examples to realize it's a general phenomenon. They happen anyway. They're not something that somebody had to invent. What are they? What do they represent? They represent a response to increasing complexity. So can layers be argued on the basis of the increasing complexity of making effective instructional designs?
I'm really struggling with that because as I look at layers, I don't think it works for all instructional design. If I'm a novice designer, I see it, like you said, it's complex, but at the same time, I don't see all the layers in my design, nor do I see the need for all those layers in my design. And so if layers is a prescriptive, or even at the very least a descriptive ideal model of what my instruction should look like, I say, no, that's
So
not what I want to do.
who would find layers worthwhile?
People that-
Experienced designers.
How,
Yeah.
should I pitch layers to a more sophisticated design audience?
I would.
No.
Why not, John?
It's not appropriate.
I see what you're saying, Keith, and I agree with you, actually.
I think an advanced designer would be, I'm good. I've got all the tools in my box, I've got so much experience, it's worked for me. I think they would be less inclined to look for new tools, less inclined to learn a new system, a new way of doing things. It would be disruptive. It would take them longer, it would make them more inefficient in the beginning.
And they're either like Robert Stake and have already got there, or they're, don't want anything new. Is that what you're?
Yeah.
Don't want to change their game.
Well, the thing that would make it, the problems are increasing and the economy is changing. The thing that I think is just the opposite. I think it needs to be easier. It makes it easier for novice people to see what they're doing.
In that case, Addy ISD is where we are.
I don't think so. I think that the designs that are coming out of that ISD are not alike. And
I agree with you.
I think that what you have to do is have the products that are coming out of layers be alive so that the user can keep using them. And that's its power. And so that the user has to be able to see the layers themselves and implement it.
Okay, John?
I think the real power of layers is two things. One is I think it's easy to understand as a novice. And second, once you've got experience and you've designed a bunch of things, it becomes more habit or tacit that you're not having to like say, okay, this is my strategy layer. It's just happening organically. Because you have these layers already ingrained in you or whatever, and you can look at a design problem and say, okay, this is how I'm going to handle it, and the layers are background now or backdrop to that problem. So you have both. You have the ease. I think the way it's laid out, yeah, 7 layers. Okay, yeah, I can figure this out. But then once you have all this experience doing it, you don't have to really think about it.
I think
It
there's
becomes a thought habit for designers.
Yeah, and I think also that if in fact it's a tool to design an organic process, then it is truer to the problem at hand.
Interesting. It causes you to think in terms of the systems.
Of the real problem,
Component
and that
systems.
means that you'll design better.
Okay, Maya?
Thinking about a few things. I really like the idea of layers because
Now remember, I'm not asking for testimonials about
No, no,
layers.
I know, but-
I'm asking why should we defend layers? And
Layers.
how should we defend layers or
Right.
attack it?
One of the things that is good about layers is that again it makes you more aware of the world is getting more and more complex with technology and just with a lot of things. So I think that layers helps you to see those complexities and helps to better incorporate that into designing instruction.
Okay?
You know what's not in layers? there's not a real explicit relationship between the layers. And I think that's a drawback, because when you're using layers, you leave it completely up to the designer to make those determinations. But yet you've prescribed these layers that ought to be there, and you're suggesting or inviting them to identify the layers without understanding the relationships. And it's understanding the relationships that's really going to give power to the design.
Now, are there just 7 layers?
Well,
No.
Go ahead, Sue.
I think we have to talk about those 7 layers at some point, but you know, if this idea of this, what did she call it? The dark woman?
Jean Dark, the
Primary
primary
generator.
generator.
Primary generator. If you think in terms of the primary generator instead of multiple complex layers that define your problem, but if you think in terms of primary generators that elaborate into layers, then you've got the thing that generates itself, because people can do that.
It's a simple.
People do that.
Yeah.
And once you're asking people to think of the single most important question they got to answer, because you know that's what Stephen Covey's doing in his stuff. He's saying, all you business guys, keep pushing toward the simple question that's really the most important, the one that you got to answer. And I think that if you think that design elaborates out of that simple generator, then rather than defining your 7 layers first as the starting point, but as how it generates out of the simple questions, then you've got really buy-in, because people can see that, I think.
Okay.
I think along those lines, I agree with what you said, except for I don't think there's one single question you're trying to answer. I think every time, so say you have a strategy that you're really trying to implement, and you have a representation that you're really trying to use, and where those hit, then you have to make the decision, okay, what's more important to me, this strategy or this representation? Because I can't have both now, because they're not working together right. The technology's not good enough to fit my idea, or whatever, and you have to make a decision at that point. And every decision, I think, along the way as you make your design, you're deciding what your primary generator is by saying, okay, my strategy is winning this one, so we're going to go this direction. Okay, now my message is going to win this one because I need to go that direction. And so you're weaving your way along, you're getting yourself there, and at the end, hopefully, you've answered all the questions and the design works.
Okay, John?
Yeah, I was gonna, building off Sue's comment, I think the advantage of starting from a primary generator and talking about how that builds into a layered design approach, I think would alleviate the concern that some people might have that, oh, there's 7 layers to instructional design, is what Andy Gibbons is saying.
Yeah. Which we should not happen.
Right, because then you're turning that, what happens if you're approaching it that way is you're doing the reverse of what you're saying is, oh, it's a process model now. There's just 7 new processes that nobody's had.
Right.
Instead of saying, no, it turns out it's not a process model, it's a functional based approach.
Yeah.
And so maybe the 7 layers
Are one example of how it's a particular instance of these 7 layers being generated in this historical instance, because those layers met the needs of the simple
Could
generator.
I choose a different set of layers? Could I cut up the pie in a different way? And
You
maybe.
should.
Okay.
And you should write one book on each layer separately and just let people get it.
That would be my retirement.
Yeah.
Or, I think of this 3-person problem, I think every really kindergarten teacher is a designer, or primary teacher.
Yeah.
And what you want is that
Every person's a designer.
every person is a designer, and if you think of it that way, well, then you think the primary teacher doesn't need a very elaborated model, she just needs to think.
Are you sure?
Well, yeah,
Are you
that's
sure, John?
I would say I would say the layers aren't important. It's when you have a design problem, whichever layers are prominent in that design problem. Because sometimes you're gonna just have 2, sometimes you'll have 3, sometimes you'll have 5, and you'll have to decide who wins the battles between them. And so it's not that there's this 7-layer thing that always is in
That's
existence.
absolute.
Yeah, it's here's my problem and which layers are important to me, and now I decide.
Yeah,
I think it's your purpose or your problem that determines which layers you need.
yes.
And the better you understand your purpose or problem, the better your design can be.
And is it possible that one layer will fragment into a number of sub-layers
I
for a
hope
particular
so.
problem?
I
Well,
hope so.
well, here's my concern with using problems though, because when you use the words of problems, you put yourself into the process camp, I guess in my mind. Maybe that's not true.
Tell me about it.
The rest of the world. But when you say you have to figure out what the problem is, to me, that you're
Purpose.
automatically shooting yourself in the foot, which is you have a
Challenge.
process.
There's a lot of
You didn't
different
buy
words,
into
but
my ambiguity model, huh?
So what would you use, John? Would be like
I think the
purpose?
primary generator is an example of one where you can use where it's new enough where that doesn't have a camp associated with processes, at least for me, and maybe I haven't read the article, so maybe that's not the best one, but I think there is that idea of staying away from the process. And I think you were trying to stay away from that, but.
I said that because I've been reading Ramo,
Ramo, Simon Ramo.
and A Cure for Chaos. I picked it up from the library, and the whole idea is systems approaches to complex social and civil problems.
Mhm.
And I don't think there's anything wrong with calling it problems in terms of systems approach. I think those two are, they're
Connected.
so related, yeah. And when you talk to teachers about instructional design, I think they'd be the first to say, there's a problem that needs to be solved here. It's the how do I effectively teach? Now there's teachers out there that won't agree with that, but the ones that are interested in improving, I think they would latch onto that.
Interesting thing about the systems approach, you're saying that was a vote in favor of the systems approach.
Yeah.
Well, do you want to throw out the systems approach?
Oh,
Yes.
no, I don't. I want to argue for it. We agreed on the organic thing, didn't we?
Right.
Yeah, so sometimes you could enter into a layers approach through a systems process
Exactly,
at
yeah,
the door.
yeah, exactly.
Well, in this book too, his whole argument is the better you understand the complexities of the system, the more effective your designs of the solution will be.
Yeah, see, there's the double bite. Here's the interesting thing about the systems approach. ADDIE ISD is called, another name for it is instructional systems design. And sometimes the authors of articles on ISD or ADDIE will talk about it as an implementation of the systems approach. Is the systems approach the way ADDIE ISD implements it,
Or Donald Trump.
the way that you're talking about the systems approach as Ramo talks about it?
I think it's different. What happens is you have an institutionalized version of ADDIE that's different from the real way that people use it, and I don't know.
So here's the double bind, and this is actually kind of a place where I would hope that we would get to. The systems approach originally broke upon the instructional design world in about 1965 time frame. Robert Gagne wrote a book. It was published in 62 to 65 time frame. It was called Psychological Principles of System Development.
Yeah.
No one in the instructional design field has read it that I know of. I've never heard it mentioned in our literature. The whole idea was he had been working in World War II on these complex technological systems, trying to get man-machine systems to arrive at the point of use at the same moment, so that the human operator was ready to operate this new system as soon as it was ready, because it was wartime. Cold War time, too. And so Gagne was writing about the systems approach in its full-bodied version. the way that Ramo talks about it.
Right.
And there is an article by Simon Ramo online called The Systems Approach. You might want to read it, it's worthwhile. The idea of the systems approach, it was a rich and deep, highly complex problem-solving process, unpredictable in its direction. Unpredictable. It's what you would use if you were designing the Bay Area Rapid Transit System in San Francisco. Where do I put the stops? I don't know. How do we choose how to, I don't know. Well, we gather some data. What are the current usage? What's the future growth trends? And you do a bunch of studies to figure out what the need is, and then you design to the need that you've identified. Might be wrong.
But I see two modern manifestations or reincarnations of the true systems approach. One is learning ecologies, which have become really popular in the last few years, and the other is communities of practice by Laban Wenger. Embracing the complexity of those interactions and then systematically addressing them.
Did you know that during the 1960s and 1970s, the systems approach led things off the rails? The Vietnam War, for instance, was a product of the systems approach. And the way it was prosecuted. McNamara was a great practitioner of the systems approach.
That's the
Now,
first time I've ever heard that.
What
That's
happened?
That's a long discussion.
It is a long discussion, I understand that, and we can have it. But we've just got a minute or two here before we get gone. Trust me on this. He was, read Halberstam's The Best and Brightest. Okay? Very interesting insight into what was happening in that period of time. These were the whiz kids. These were the guys, the systems engineers from Ford, the ones who knew how to research and find right answers through completely rational, logical processes. Scientific-based decision-making. See, it comes back to the science question again, doesn't it? Okay, so here's the thing. What happened to the systems approach? Well, it turned into a formula. In the field of instructional design, this writing that Gagne did, which was full-bodied and unsequenced and alive, it was a live process, got poured down into a bunch of diagrams that are now the fundamental textbooks in the instructional design field, which haven't changed all that much over the last 40 years. Two-dimensional diagrams, box diagrams that go this way. Is design a two-dimensional process, you ask yourself? Well, so what happened over time was the vigor of the process, the vigor of the designer's problem-solving thinking went down over time. It declined, it became too much effort, it became too much complexity for the average designer, the individual classroom teacher.
Given what they were required to do,
To
and the
handle.
time and resources they had.
I understand. But it got simplified down to the point where now even classroom teachers don't use it. We teach it as a part of the curriculum in many places in the U.S., but teachers endure those classes rather than really making a life-changing decision. Okay? So what happens? You've got this live, vigorous design process, you've got this formula following process, and gravity takes you down this way. Gravity always takes you down to the comfort zone. Now, here's the dilemma with layers that I see. How do you argue the idea of layers? Do you sell it to the beginner designer and get enthused, a group of young designers who are willing to make some experiments and pay the price to get into the mindset, to use these as a flexible set of thinking tools, the way John has described? Or do you cast it as a theory for experienced designers who want to continue to improve their craft, who want some new design insights, who feel that it's time for us to start thinking in some new directions?
What's your goal?
That's what I'm asking.
Or is
What
it,
do you, who do you argue to, and what do you argue?
or is it that,
How do you defend this as a useful idea?
or is it that the experienced designers will recognize it. They'll say, oh, I already knew that. That's a good way of expressing what I have come to understand.
Maybe there will be some. Maybe there will some say, look, I've taught this instructional design course now for 30 years, and I haven't changed my syllabus since then. And I'm sure not going to do it now.
Why?
But someone like that
That's
is
how they make
pretty
their living.
much a lost cause. I mean, you're not gonna win over them with anyone.
Yeah. Do you see the dynamic of introducing, here's what this discussion turned out to be about. What's the dynamic of introducing a new way of looking at things into a practice field in such a way that the vigor of the ideas is not lost? The idea of these ideas as a tool for designers, a tool for thinkers, will not be affected by gravity pulling it down. How do you do that?
I got to get pretty close to David Fetterman at AEA, and he over the last 20 years has really been a proponent of collaboratory, participatory empowerment evaluation. And at first, there was so much gravity, people were saying, oh, this is just like X. But he has continued to present at conferences, and he has a massive network of people now that he works with to diffuse this idea into organizations in practical ways. So I think
Interesting.
that's,
Create a community, create a culture.
yeah.
Another way you can go about doing this is you use facilitative theorizing, which I think Dr. Yantar has an article on, where you leave it. One of the themes of facilitative theorizing is you leave it incomplete and you let the practitioner complete it. So they take ownership, they personalize it. You don't, it's not like a doctor, take these pills and you'll be healthy. You know, you give them enough that they then take it and run with it and do whatever they want with it.
You create a system of ideas that's organic, that people can adopt and adapt.
What I was really thinking, this book is really kind of fascinating to me because I took all these notes on it when I was reading it last week.
Shell's
and then,
book.
Huh?
Which book?
His,
Oh.
his draft. And I was thinking, this is a really interesting design problem in itself. You think of your book, so last week I was saying to you, so, gee, you've got these purposes, and I said, so you have this layers idea, and then you have this history idea, and then you said, and, so I went home and I said, oh, okay, now I want to figure out what all the layers of this book are. And that, I mean, such an interesting problem. How is it that you design, because books are linear.
Yeah.
They aren't,
They unfold like a narrative.
they really do unfold like a narrative. And so I've been thinking about that. This is a really interesting design problem to define the layers of this text and to say, if it's going to be linear, what holds all the layers together?
Yeah.
It's a really interesting problem that we should talk about. I think that's fair game for us to talk about.
Well, let's start next time. Here, let's do this. Let's talk about each of the, we're going to talk about each of the layers this time, weren't we? Let's talk about each of the layers next time, okay? Individually. And let's talk about what value added they offer. What is their value proposition to a designer, and to which designer? The beginner, the experienced designer, the large scale, the small scale. So thank you very much, everybody. We'll see you.